Hey everyone, still out and about. Just wanted to make a few comments about the Unit 4 discussion. Once again, you did a great job of being collegial in your comments with one another. I think that's always something to hold front and center and keep in mind, and I'm proud of you for doing that. You also asked very good questions. Um, Please remember to avoid counterfactual questions, though, and remember those are the kinds of questions they're essentially hypothetical. Um, but they cause us to do the what if thing. What if Evita would have lived longer, or what if things wouldn't have worked out the way they actually did? And as I've said before, those are great for generating discussion in a lot of ways, but they tend to elicit responses that are not grounded in evidence. And because that's what we're working on first and foremost with our discussion assignments, that's why I ask you to avoid those kinds of questions. So if you are wondering what that means or have any questions for me about that, please let me know. Also, please remember that you need to include specific cited evidence from the readings, the videos, any course material to support your ideas. You always need to show, not just tell, why you think something, why your answer is a certain way. And that's the core of historical work, historical analysis, is basing our ideas on evidence. So please include that evidence in your discussion posts, your discussion responses, um, and let me know if you have any questions about that. I think we did a good job on our discussion. We mostly focused on Evita Peron and on Lázaro Cárdenas. And they're both kind of, I don't know if I want to say they're two sides of the same coin or if they're sort of the same coin, but they represent both nationalism and populism in Latin America. And we really focused on nationalism in Unit 4. So in Chastain, he helped us think about nationalism in terms of focusing on what the best parts of a nation are. And in Latin America, what this meant, in the case of the Mexican Revolution, was like the archetypical kind of armed movement of the nationalist period. Or if we're looking at reform movements, or if we're looking at populism, the whole idea of nationalism during the first half of the 20th century was that um, uh, minorities, indigenous people, indigenous cultures were seen as valuable, at least officially and at least on paper. I wish I didn't have to make that distinction, but that's the way it was in various Latin American nations. There was a trend toward indigenismo, which really meant putting the indigenous front and center, tracing roots back thousands and thousands of years to various indigenous peoples that had even been contested and wiped out by Spanish and Portuguese colonialism, and saying that's an important key part of our national identity, our national ethos. That's a big step forward from the scientific racism of the neo-colonial period, so going back to the late 19th century, turn of the 20th. Neo-colonial impulses were those efforts, especially economically and in terms of culture and social norms, for Europe and the United States to really exert a lot of influence throughout Latin America. Many Latin American elites followed suit because doing so allowed them to have a lot of power, wealth, and authority. Uh, but they had to do so at the expense of sort of selling out their national cultures. That's not to say that national cultures based on indigenismo weren't invented. National cultures are invented or imagined, as one prominent historian of nationalism has pointed out. A nation is an imagined community, meaning most of us in the United States, the nation that we belong to, will never meet everyone else. Well, none of us will ever meet everyone else in this nation. We won't know everyone. It's too large a group for that. So there are other ways that we are sort of inspired to identify as Americans. There are a lot of symbols, a shared history, certain ideals that we hold true that, again, can be interpreted different ways, can be sort of divisive in a certain regard. But those are the things, again, that give us sort of national cohesion. In Latin America, that was a question. 19th century, 20th century, even today, what is the nation supposed to look like? what are these shared ideals that hold us together? The answer to that in the first half of the 20th century was indigenismo. It was celebrating mestizaje, so like Jose Vasconcelos' cosmic race coming out of the Mexican Revolution, the notion that mestizos are actually stronger ethnically and culturally, that really flew in the face of that scientific racism of an earlier generation. So again, this is a major sea change, but it has its limitations. And even the United States, the American Revolution, although we celebrated and it's a key element of our national identity, certainly had its limitations. Ideas about equality were not extended to everyone early on in our republic. Much the same was happening in Latin America, and people like even Lázaro Cárdenas, who was probably one of the more benign populists, and I'm going to say that because, as some of you pointed out from the Knight article, he was above being bribed. He was beyond reproach in a lot of ways, and he worked really hard to be that way. He worked really hard not just to kind of garner a reputation of being standing up for the people, providing land, looking out for the good of Mexico by nationalizing oil, which again became a corrupt mess in subsequent years. But all these steps he took, there was a kind of genuine concern for the nation and for its people. That it wasn't just a reputation thing, but it was something he actually did. He really was beyond reproach in a lot of ways. That said, the kind of system that he was able to create, because he had such allegiance to his own populism, meaning that people could identify directly with him as a person because he spoke to them. This is something Juan Perón did, this is something Getulio Vargas did, this is something FDR did. During this sort of same time frame, he had that sort of power, and so what Knight points out is that didn't exist in a vacuum. There were limitations on what he could do, but then there were also sort of problems with what he created, I guess we should say. He created a corporatist state in which the state, the federal government in Mexico, was the guarantor of land redistribution, for example. It was the guarantor of labor unionization. It was the guarantor of all these things. That's not necessarily a problem when the state is actually accountable to the people. However, the one-party system that Luis reminded us, maybe it was in his journal, so maybe he didn't remind us, but pointed out again, Mario Vargas Llosa, a famous Peruvian novelist, commented that the PRI, or the one-party state in Mexico, was the perfect dictatorship. And it was, for all intents and purposes. So the point here, in all my rambling, is that Cárdenas set that up. Whatever his intentions were, however good it could be, that was what was set up, and subsequent presidents didn't really follow in his footsteps in terms of actually trying to be accountable to the people and making good on promises. Instead, they used that structure in ways that really heightened their own power and prestige and actually created a lot of room for corruption and major problems. So that is my spiel for looking at nationalism. What it is, where its shortcomings lie. I tried to use the examples that we've most focused on so that we can think about it in a bigger way, but also see the problems with populism. So again, nationalism, populism, these things are not problematic per se, but they can create problematic situations. So again, I'll leave it at that. Thanks for your hard work once again, and I'll talk to you again soon.